The Taliban is taking control of more of Afghanistan, and as Afghan soldiers flee the country, U.S. troops also leave. How worrying are these latest developments, and will Washington reconsider its plans? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. There is growing concern about the future of Afghanistan as the U.S. and allied troops prepare to leave the country. Afghan forces are surrendering outposts and escaping in their hundreds to neighboring Tajikistan. Those that do face the Taliban put up little or no resistance. The heart of U.S. operations in Afghanistan for almost 2 decades, the Bagram Air Base, is empty of American troops. And the Taliban is pressing on with its territorial campaign, making significant gains. The armed group now controls almost a third of the country's 400 districts, mainly in the north. It took over 13 areas on Saturday alone, the biggest single-day advance in the 20-year war. And it's more than doubled the number of areas it controls since the U.S. accelerated its pullout in May. The Afghan government says it's sending reinforcements to retake the territory it's lost. Now, many families have fled the fighting and now fear for their safety. Afghan soldiers surrendered multiple posts in the northern province of Badakhshan at the weekend, and the Taliban also captured a strategic district in Kandahar further south. The area has been a heartland for the group, and it's where its leader was born. Homara Chowdhury has our report.
Abandoned and empty. Families have been forced to flee Kandahar after fierce fighting between Afghan government forces and the Taliban. They say they can't defeat the armed group on their own.
There is no peace. If one helicopter came here, it would be enough for all of Kandahar. Why don't they use helicopters against them? They targeted me. They tried to kill me. If they killed me, then who will look after my children?
Asadullah, a local police commander, says they're under-resourced and struggle in the fight against the armed group.
The situation is going to be bad. Police and border forces have equipment problems. Commandos and the National Army are based a bit far, and we're on the front line.
The advances made by the Taliban in this key southern province came on the same day the city's governor was killed by a car bomb in the regional capital. Panjwai is the 5th district in Kandahar province to fall to the armed group in recent weeks as the Taliban offensive gains momentum. They claim to have seized more than 100 out of nearly 400 districts in the country, with a strong presence in the north.
Thanks to God, and this was proven before, that the majority of the Afghan people in the previous era during the Taliban rule for more than 10 years. We are now in control of more than 70% of the territories. It is simply because the people know us very well and the Afghan people have no problem dealing with us.
But many Afghans are frightened. They're concerned the security situation in the country will only worsen once US forces eventually leave.
Not only me, but all Afghans are worried that the Taliban will take over Afghanistan as US troops leave the country. No one in Afghanistan is completely satisfied with the Taliban. From the day the issue of the withdrawal of foreign troops arose, it has had a negative impact on the daily work of people.
The fall of Panjwai district comes just days after US and NATO forces vacated their main Bagram air base near Kabul. The remaining US troops will officially leave the country on September the 11th, a move many regional experts say will only help the Taliban consolidate its growing control of the country. Homara Chowdhury, Al Jazeera.
Well, the U.S. agreed last year to withdraw all its troops from Afghanistan in return for a commitment by the Taliban not to allow armed groups to operate in the areas it controls. Just 650 American troops have stayed to secure the U.S. Embassy and Kabul airport, and the majority of NATO forces have also now left. President Joe Biden set a deadline of the 20-year anniversary of the September 11 attacks on the U.S. for American troops to fully withdraw. But the pullout has been accelerated and is expected to end before then. The Taliban's military campaign could affect peace talks aimed at ending the country's years of conflict. The Afghan government and Taliban negotiators have held several rounds of talks in Qatar's capital, Doha, but little progress has been made. Well, let's bring in our guests for today's Inside Story. In Kabul, we have Obaidullah Bahir, who is a lecturer of transitional justice at the American University of Afghanistan. From Istanbul, Peter Galbraith, former deputy UN envoy to Afghanistan, and also in Kabul, Faiz Zaland, political commentator and professor at Kabul University. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Thank you for being with us on Inside Story. Faiz Zaland, let me start with you in Kabul. The Taliban claims to control 70% of territory in Afghanistan today, mainly in the north. How worrying to you are these advances and territorial gains?
Thanks for having me. I think the situation in Afghanistan has gotten worse since the rapid or hasty withdrawal of Mr. Biden's command. Things are not going to a right direction. Taliban have already taken more than 124 districts, especially north is already under the siege. Some of the main provincial centers are under the siege. IDPs, internal displaced people, are getting larger and larger in many groups. Some are coming to Kabul, some are getting to the closest secure places. It all affects the peace and intra-Afghan dialogue strategy. There is no peace process, especially the Doha process seems a deadlock. It really affects not only politically, but economically and socially also the country. People are worried about their undecided future.
So worrying developments in your view. Obaidullah Bahir, in Kabul also, some 1,000 Afghan soldiers have fled to Tajikistan in the last few days. This doesn't bode very well, does it? I mean, how can we expect the Afghan army to take over security once the Americans pull out completely? Do you think that even with reinforcements, they'll be able to take control?
Look, I think it might be unfair to take this as a generalization of the war reality. The idea is right now the Taliban are enjoying a momentum handed to them by the United States administration based on its hasty and unconditional withdrawal, and after that reinforcing their sense of impending victory by releasing intelligence reports that say that the government is going to collapse in 6 to 12 months. All of that hasn't boded well with the spirits of the actual defense forces. And there are other strategic reasons as well, where the Afghan government has chosen to tactically retreat from specific districts, which has created this sense of defeatism amongst its own troops. That is
that why we're seeing Afghan troops flee to places like Tajikistan?
Yeah, so that's basically one of the reasons why we have low morale and spirits. But again, this is not going to be a rule. This is not going to exist too long. Eventually, the fighting will die out to a certain extent. The Eid holidays coming up as well. This has to be seen as a blitz by the Taliban movement. This has to be an offensive. It is unrealistic to believe that the Taliban can sustain this fighting for undefined periods of time. So this will eventually come down a little, and the Afghan government and defense forces just need to hold their ground and probably interact better with their own soldiers to understand better communication strategies and keep morale higher.
Peter Galbraith, are you as optimistic as Obaidullah, who says this is a blitz by the Taliban, that the fighting will eventually stop? Do you share that thought?
I think my position would be somewhere between the positions of your two other guests. There's no doubt that the Taliban have a demonstrated ability to control large parts of the Afghan countryside, but they haven't demonstrated an ability to take and hold cities. And so that really is what remains to be seen, because that's where in the final analysis, the test for control of Afghanistan will be determined. I think it's also important to remember that the Taliban is not a broad-based movement within Afghanistan. There are large segments of the Afghan population that regard the Taliban, well, in the case of the Hazaras, who are, 10, 15% of the population, that are Shiite, they see the Taliban as a genocidal enemy. And that part of the country will resist to the bitter end. The Taliban, even when they were in power, never controlled all of Afghanistan. There's significant parts of the Tajik inhabited areas that will resist. So, and I find it hard to believe that they're going to be able to take Kabul. They can operate inside Kabul. They can sow terror. I think the Americans, they have two images of what might happen. Mm-hmm. One is Saigon in 1975, where the South Vietnamese collapsed that spring and the North Vietnamese came and took Saigon. But that was an organized army, which the Taliban don't have. And the other image would be Mosul in northern Iraq in 2014, right, where maybe 100 ISIS fighters came and took the city from 30,000 Iraqis.
But do you think now is the time, really, for the American, given these advances, even if they're not in Kabul yet, as you say, and you don't think that they will take Kabul, is now the time for the U.S. to close the book on the Afghan conflict? There are some who've said that this is an irresponsible exit.
Well, it was I'm sure this is not actually the exit that President Biden would have liked, but basically, Donald Trump was determined to get out. A year ago, he signed what was effectively a surrender agreement. And so the choice for President Biden was, do you stay with that agreement or do you break it and then renew have very significant Taliban attacks on American forces? And frankly, the president has come in. The country's a mess. He's focused on his domestic agenda. He's got a number of foreign policy challenges that are very big: climate, nuclear nonproliferation, both North Korea and Iran. And so, to have reversed course is not something that I think was very easy for him to do. Unfortunately, has weakened the U.S. leverage in terms of negotiating a peaceful settlement between the government and the Taliban.
Obaidullah, speaking of the negotiations, I mean, the Taliban, you seem to be optimistic that this fighting will eventually stop. But the Taliban right now are in a strong position. They believe, anyway, that they're in a strong position, having made all these territorial gains. Why negotiate right now? What is the incentive for them to negotiate with the Afghan government when they clearly believe that they're in a stronger position than the government in Kabul?
Look, initially, I never said that the fighting would stop. I'm just hypothesizing that eventually we will settle on a stalemate. So we'll have an escalated stalemate in Afghanistan, but it's not going to be a total victory for either end. With regards to your question of why negotiate, again, I think that's very clear-cut for the Taliban. The Taliban spent a few months trying to negotiate until their recent declaration of going to the Istanbul summit with a low-level delegation and setting impossible conditions for participating. So it looks like the group within it, the intra-politics of the Taliban, is overwhelmingly towards the side of fighting for total control and absolute takeover of Afghanistan. Within Afghanistan as well, again, the political elites should not be spared any blame because they have no vision for a unified peace proposal or roadmap. And before that, Khalilzad himself and the U.S. administration, when they signed the peace deal with the Taliban, either they had a plan that didn't go right or they didn't have a plan altogether for the intra-Afghan talks. But right now, I think it's essential to forget the prospects of peace talk because it takes political capital. The insurgency can both fight and negotiate at the same time. The government cannot. The international community needs to take a cutthroat stance on the current escalated violence within Afghanistan, rather than sitting and hoping that things get better or one side wins, and then they have to take a moral decision on which side to support. The international community needs to step in and sanction the violators, right? The offenders or the insurgency, because either ask them if they want to honestly and truthfully negotiate, well and good. But if that is not happening and we see it on the battlefield, then the international community really needs to pick a side.
All right. Let me ask you, Faisal, and your thoughts about the peace process and the prospects of any negotiated settlement being agreed before the complete U.S. pullout, which is, again, slated for September 11th, but might happen sooner. Are you sharing the same view as Obaidullah, who says forget about the prospects of peace talks right now?
No, it's very frightening hearing and listening that U.S. is having two pictures for Afghanistan. One is the Saigon, the Vietnam exit, and the second one is Mosul. I think it was not agreed. What was agreed in the agreement with Taliban, there were 4 elements, 4 points that must have been implemented. Otherwise, there is no agreement. It was said by Mr. Khalilzad that nothing is promised till everything is promised. Now we see that Afghanistan is facing insecurity, high violence, collapse of districts, and close to the collapse of provincial centers, and nobody is taking care of what is going on the ground. So it really depends on international community led by U.S. to intervene in this situation and create a momentum on the peace process. The peace process, without intra-Afghan peace process, there won't be any winner for the war. The war will not have a winner. The winner will only be those terrorist groups that they have brought in international community led by US and NATO to Afghanistan 20 years ago. It will happen again. There will be again terrorist groups joining together in Afghanistan. They will be terrorizing not only Afghanistan, but it will terrorize the region and also the international community. So better we manage a peace process where we find a solution.
Peter Galbraith, he's right, Faiz, in saying that a deteriorating security situation has implications not just for Afghanistan, but for the whole region. And you talked about, 2 possible scenarios, one being Saigon and the other Mosul, which are frankly not great scenarios for either of them for Afghanistan. Do you see the Biden administration possibly reconsidering its decision to completely withdraw from Afghanistan?
No. This decision is made, and it will go forward. I want to be clear, when I was describing Mosul and Saigon as 2 scenarios that, of course, they're not scenarios that Americans want to have happen. They're ones that Americans fear. But I was starting to say I'm not sure that either scenario is actually likely because the circumstances are so different. The Taliban are not like the North Vietnamese army, an organized military force. And in the case, the Afghan army is not like the Iraqi army in Mosul, which was seen as an enemy occupying force by the population and by the those Iraqi army units that were there. The Afghan army does have a commitment to their home territory. I think to the capital. So I'm not sure there's going to be a rapid collapse. I think what is more likely is, unfortunately, that there's going to be a very long-lasting civil war.
Right.
And I'm not sure that it's going to be possible to negotiate some kind of settlement on terms that would be acceptable to both the government and the Taliban.
And Peter Galbraith, it's not just the Taliban, is it? There are also other armed groups like ISIL who are threatening the security of Afghanistan. How does the Biden administration, when it says it's not going to abandon Afghanistan, how exactly does the U.S. administration planning to fulfill this pledge of preventing al-Qaeda, ISIL, and these other armed groups from making Afghanistan their safe haven?
Well, the agreement that the United States has with the Taliban is that it's the Taliban's job to prevent ISIL and al-Qaeda and these other groups that have their targets not only inside Afghanistan but outside Afghanistan. And so if those groups actually get a foothold there, and the Taliban fails to keep its commitment to not allow those groups to be operating from its territory, then I think you're going to see a different United States posture, quite possibly some reintroduction of forces and counterterrorism, certainly intervention from the air. The President Biden is not going to tolerate Afghanistan returning to be a base for either al-Qaeda or for the Islamic State.
Obaidullah, your thoughts about this. What does the future hold? Do you see Afghanistan becoming a safe haven once again for these armed groups?
Again, I highly doubt that the Biden administration would commit the political suicide of reversing their decision. I like the conviction of your guest from Turkey with his no. Yeah, again, like there is going to be a security vacuum. If there is going to be a civil war and escalated violence, there's always going to be room for different groups to operate. It's going to spill over onto neighboring regions. Again, the Taliban have very close familial ties with groups like Al-Qaeda. The insurgency in Afghanistan has been very fluid in its nature in the past 20 years, where fighters have been fighting like contractors and mercenaries rather than strictly loyal to and have allegiances to groups. That means that the same fighters, and you can see this from the dossiers of a lot of prisoners that are taken in within Afghanistan. There are a lot of Taliban fighters under dossiers of Al-Qaeda and vice versa, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that it's very difficult to distinguish between them, and especially during an armed conflict of this escalation, it's going to be very difficult for the Taliban to stay true to anything that they have promised in the peace deal.
Obaidullah, the war, the U.S. involvement anyway, was launched with widespread international support. But of course, over the years, it became very unpopular in the same way that, you know, forced the British to withdraw from Afghanistan and the Soviets as well. What would you say is the legacy of America's involvement in Afghanistan? Did anything good come out of it?
There is plenty of good. The good is the life that the cities enjoy. However, it was unfair because it created these pockets of civilization and modernity that never managed to seep through to the rest of Afghanistan. The United States catastrophically failed in making sure that there was good governance within Afghanistan, either be it the corruption or just be it the fraudulent elections that constantly kept happening here. So the democratic process normally in countries that haven't seen democracy improves and evolves with time. In Afghanistan, it constantly kept losing popularity. We saw a lot of policies that were culturally insensitive, first by the United States, be it their prisons, the legacy of Bagram and the dark legacy that they left behind there, be it the way they conducted counterinsurgency, and the fact that the governments of Afghanistan that followed after were mostly made out of diasporas that came from abroad and wanted to mimic those policies. So all of those were grave failures. If those hadn't happened, the rural population of Afghanistan would be standing by this government, you know?
Okay, Faizaland, I'll give you the last word. What do you think is the legacy of the American involvement in Afghanistan, and how concerned and worried are Afghans today about what lies ahead?
I think if we are explaining U.S. legacy in the context of nation-state building, it was a complete failure. If we see regarding the commitment of U.S. in Afghanistan, bringing peace, bringing security, bringing good governance, bringing democracy, bringing the people to the uproot, it all failed. Today we have a failed government, we have a failed democracy, we have a failed governance, which we see the results by taking over from the Taliban in more than 100 districts in a month. Regarding the development, yes, we do have schools, we do have clinics, we do have roads, but the legacy that Soviets remained in the development is far more visible than the legacy that US is leaving. We don't have any big hydroelectric dams. We don't have any big national projects which we can say that this was a legacy of US from past 20 years. But we do have such hydroelectric dams, big roads, big tunnels, big transportations, and big housing schemes from Soviet Union. So it's a bit conflicting, and it's a bit resistible that how can we evaluate the legacy that we are having from the US. But it is a repetition of the history in Afghanistan.
So history,
I think we are
repeating itself. Yes. Thank you so much. We'll leave it there because we're running out of time. Thank you so much, Faizaland, Obaidullah Baher, Peter Galbraith. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. And thank you for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Fuli Batibo, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.